Okay, so this week's module we will be focusing on silviculture and really the nuts and bolts of forest manipulation as a means of reaching our goals as forest managers. And as we'll explore, the management that we implement at the property level or project level has ecosystem level and landscape level impacts. If we break down the word, the root of the word silviculture is silva, Latin for trees, with the term culture referring to the growing of something, right? So the practice of silviculture refers to the suite of management practices we utilize as foresters to establish forest land and guide the development of forest land to meet our objectives. There's a misconception that the term silviculture only really applies to the manipulation of forest stands towards goals of timber production. And this is not the case. Silviculture, the manipulation of forest land, may be directed towards all of the goals that we've discussed previously in class, including wildlife habitat creation and watershed management, just to name a couple of them. The study of silvics is essentially the understanding of how individual trees grow, compete, and respond to natural disturbance within a given ecosystem. Silvics provides the foundation for silviculture. An understanding of the requirements of different forest tree species is essential if we are to manage for or against a particular species or towards a particular forest structure. Every species is different. The varying levels of shade tolerance among tree species is a primary example of how they may be different in terms of their growth requirements and how they may respond to disturbance. So our silvicultural decisions are driven by the objectives of the landowner. These objectives, particularly among non-industrial private forest landowners, are often varied, but they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So you can typically accomplish more than one objective at a given time. Some of these objectives are listed on the slide. They include timber production, wildlife habitat creation, watershed management, and possibly ecological restoration. Through silviculture, we have the ability to increase the saw timber value within a forest. We may also speed up the production of saw timber and increase wood yield. From a wildlife perspective, you guys already know that all wildlife species are different, and as such they require different habitat types. We may provide this habitat, may it be young forest or old forest, a particular vegetation species composition. We can provide all this through silviculture. We can change these things through silviculture. Of particular importance in the western U.S. and likely of increasing importance in the southeast with a warming climate is the ability of forest managers to increase the water yield of forest land, of forested watersheds, by reducing the density and number of trees within a forest. The objectives of ecological restoration, the restoration of desirable ecosystem characteristics that have been compromised or eliminated by past land use practices, or an alteration in natural disturbance regime, these goals can be met in part through silviculture as well. The evolution of silviculture in the U.S. very much tracks the evolution of land use practices. Thinking back to our history module earlier in the semester, our initial use was one of exploitation, propelled by this belief that the forest resources of this new country were inexhaustible. With the introduction of scientific forestry built upon the principles of silviculture, in the early 1900s we begin to see a move towards a more systematic cultivation of forest resources with the purpose of full utilization of timber resources. As evidenced by the evolution of the US Forest Service management regime, several decades later we begin to see a recognition of the importance of multiple use management. And this signals a change in silvicultural principles as well. The philosophy that drives much of the forest management in the United States today is one of ecosystem management. Above all else, it's just a recognition of how our forest use, how our forest management, in the name of meeting the needs of society, affects broader ecological processes in terms of both biodiversity and ecological resilience. So this guy here, Gifford Pinchot, is often credited with importing the practice of silviculture from Western Europe. He was a proponent of this full utilization concept. He was, really advocating the concept of planting trees, cutting trees, planting trees, sort of in this systematic cultivation. The system's really favored by countries who had to maximize production due to the limited amount of space and the limited amount of forest resources that they had in the face of growing populations. However, in America, a young country by comparison with a substantial amount of wilderness still intact, this full utilization model was never really fully adopted. Early foresters more or less dabbled with more conservative approaches resembling what we consider now as selection systems or selection regeneration systems, a concept that we're going to examine closer later in the lecture here. That was until the US Forest Service adopted a more aggressive approach to timber production, driven chiefly by economic goals. The U.S. Forest Service began to adopt clear-cut harvesting regeneration systems in earnest by the 1960s on U.S. Forest Service land. Again, this is a picture of the Bitterroot National Forest around this time period. These systems, these clear-cut harvesting systems, were deemed more economically expedient, with the objective of sustained timber yield as the primary focus. In short, the U.S. Forest Service was growing timber, but they were failing to meet the other objectives demanded by society. The scientific argument that clear cuts are necessary to grow shade-intolerant species, the species of highest value really on most U.S. Forest Service land, is not invalid necessarily, but as we'll see shortly, it doesn't take a 350-acre clear cut like those on the Monongahela National Forest to grow shade-intolerant species. So again, the meeting of objectives, the meeting of several objectives at once, it is a possible thing. It just takes the planning is a little more complicated, and the silviculture that's implemented ends up being a little more nuanced. Following the public fallout from the harvesting practices of the U.S. Forest Service in the mid to late 20th century, and based on an increasing understanding of the impact of timber harvesting on such things as carbon sequestration, nutrient cycling, and landscape scale wildlife habitat, much of our forestry today is framed by this concept of ecosystem management, or which is primarily silviculture based fundamentally on the natural disturbance regime of the forest ecosystem being managed. Now again, this isn't the primary philosophy of every land management organization, but it is a growing trend among both public resource managers and private land managers who have objectives beyond just a sustained yield of timber. So natural disturbance regime, defined as the size, frequency, intensity, and pattern of natural disturbances in a given region, really dictates the forest dynamics of an ecosystem. The type of disturbance common to forest ecosystems drives what species are present within that ecosystem. When those species are present within the ecosystem is driven by natural disturbance regime and also the overall structure of the forest ecosystem. Specifically whether forest land is typically even-aged or uneven-aged. This concept of forest age structure we'll get into in a little bit as well. The natural disturbance regime of the southern Appalachians is really characterized by relatively frequent but small-scale events, things like windstorms, small-scale wind throw and blowdown events as a result of thunderstorms. But there are also less frequent but important events that cause sort of broader scale disturbance, things like ice storms, hurricane force winds. But these events happen less frequently. By understanding the response of forest land to these disturbances, we can really tailor our management accordingly and perpetuate the ecological conditions that we'd like to perpetuate while utilizing the resources that we need to utilize. And in doing so, we don't take away from the inherent ecological resiliency of the forest itself.